Namaste, welcome to Opinionated. The topic for today is can the Indian light tank Zorawar survive the modern battlefield? Now, we saw a couple of days back with a lot of fanfare that DRDO and the Indian Army and L&T, Lawson Tubro, the manufacturer, they showed Zorawar to the whole world, which is a light battle tank and Indian Army is expected to order 59 of these tanks shortly, and then uh, beyond 350 tanks in near future. So, in this discussion, we will dive deep and explore if Zorawar can actually survive the modern battlefield, especially against the PLA, which is the People Liberation Army in China. Now, before we go there, let's understand why Zorawar even why the why did we even build Zorawar in the first place, right? To get a better look at that, a couple of years back when India and China had a face-off in Galwan, in Ladakh, and the Chishul Bowl, uh, what we saw is China deployed a huge number of light tanks. Their light tanks are known as the Tai 15. And they deployed these light tanks in the plains at an altitude higher than 10,000 feet, between 10,000 and 15,000 feet, depending on the particular place. Now, Indian Army had to counter the Chinese deployment uh, by deploying their own tanks, which was essentially T-90 and T-72. Now, quickly, Indian Army found out that it isn't actually easy to deploy heavier tanks in these regions, and this is for a couple of reasons. Number one is uh, in this region, the soil is very dusty, so heavier tanks and armor can get bogged down. Secondly, the air is very thin, so the internal combustion engine of these tanks don't produce enough power, so the tanks find it difficult to climb beyond a particular gradient, and if it gets stuck it finds it difficult to extract itself out of that situation. Also, they found out that you can land these tanks in the region, but if you need to perform overhaul or if you need to maintain these tanks, if you want to fly them out, that is very difficult, because while the problem is the aircrafts, transport aircrafts that we have, uh, while their capability to the payload capability in the planes in the sea level is beyond 50 tons, at these altitude the payload drops significantly to less than 35 tons. So while you can take that tank, you cannot bring that tank away by the same aircraft, right? And you cannot bring the tank back using roads, because the roads are very narrow, very treacherous, and not meant to handle so much weight. So the Indian Army strategic planners and the strategic planning community and the government found that with the existing armor, it's very difficult to counter the Chinese deployment in these regions, especially in Himalayas. Uh, the Chinese tank in question was the Tai 15 light tank, which is a 33-ton tank with a 1,000 horsepower engine. It is a pretty standard, run of the mill tank, nothing extra special on this one. But the thing that gives a significant advantage to Type 15 is its power to weight ratio. So it's just 33 tons, but it has almost the same power as of a T90, which is 48 tons. Uh, Now, this is the T90 Indian main battle tank that India deployed to counter the Chinese armor. And the T90 main battle tank had a significantly worse power to weight ratio than the Type 15. Uh, so, which puts India into a disadvantage, especially if it has to counter the deployments and counter the maneuvering warfare plan that Chinese army or the PLA wants to bring in this region if there's an escalation, right? So uh, the tenets of maneuver warfare, essentially you need to outmaneuver your opponent, create chaos, create confusion, uh, and then defeat the enemy. Now we've seen that in Operation Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom, or if I forget if it was Enduring Freedom or Iraqi Freedom, but it was one of those. That United States Army employed maneuvering warfare. They very rapidly got to the flanks of Iraqi armor. They got into advantageous positions, which before the Iraqi armor could respond, and they effectively destroyed the Iraqi armor before even Iraqi armor could counter deploy or counter maneuver. Right, and one essential thing here is the speed and tempo. Now, the main worry that the Indian planners and the strategists had is that the Indian armor, which is spearheaded by the T-90, won't be able to maintain the speed and tempo required to counter maneuver against PLA, right? And hence they wanted DRDO and private companies to work on a light tank which has a very high power to weight ratio and can counter the Type 15 in this mountainous region. And hence we have the Zorawar, the light tank, which is a 25-ton tank with approximately a 750 to 800 horsepower engine. The engine is still not sure. Uh, some say it is a American Cummins engine. Some say it's a MTU, engine by Rolls Royce. Depending upon the engine, it is 750 to 800 horsepower. We'll know more about that. Again, it's a pretty much standard run of the mill tank, very similar to Type 15. What I see here is it has standard optics. One optics on the gunner or the driver's side, one on the commander's side. It has a remote controlled turret on the top that has I guess 50 Browning uh, machine gun. It has a 105 main turret. Uh, and what also looks interesting, it has probably two anti-tank missile carried on the side of the turret. But apart from that, there I don't see anything special in the tank, right? I don't see any active protection system. I don't see any ERA. I don't see any additional type of armor. So it's pretty much the standard tank design that we saw in the 90s and 2000s, right? So the question is, will this survive the modern battlefield? Now, we see two modern battlefields, one in Ukraine, one in the Gaza Israel front. And what we have learned from these two battlefields that both Russian and Western armor has found it very difficult to survive. Uh, and Israeli armor as well have found it difficult to survive in Gaza. And one of the primary reason is the enemies, both in this case Ukraine, Russia, and the Hamas terrorist group. They have access to very cheap FPV drones and shoulder-fired anti-tank missiles. Now, these FPV drones can be launched, you know, tens of kilometers away from these tanks, and they are very, very effective uh, in destroying these tanks. Similarly, uh, a lot of these tanks have found that its top armor on the turret is very vulnerable against missiles like Javelin or Spike, right? Which some of these countries have in plentiful. So we know today that heavier tanks, much heavier than Zorawar, tanks with armor, with heavy armor and tonnage exceeding 50 tons, exceeding in some cases 60 tons in case of Leopard or Abrams. And even those tanks found it difficult to survive in the battlefield when it is not complemented by extra protection, right? Now, what you see in your screen is an FPV drone. These are very cheap drone, carries probably 10 pounds of uh, uh, penetrator warhead that can penetrate armor, probably a staged charged weapon or a high explosive anti-tank weapon, or perhaps even a shaped charged that can destroy any tank, and especially the vulnerable areas when it attacks from the top. Uh, these drones are very, very cheap. These are mostly commercial drones, very rudimentary but very effective. While the tank costs upwards of multi-million dollar, like a T90 costs excess of $2 to $3 million, these drones are literally $2,000 per drone, right? So you know the enemy can bring to bear a lot more drones to counter a particular tank. Similarly, you have ATGMs like Javelin, which are very, very effective against tanks, right? They go and fly on top of a tank, and they explode on top of a tank, which is the most vulnerable part of the tank. Uh, so we've seen that in order to survive, both Ukrainian tanks, Russian tanks, and Israeli tanks have started to get creative, and they are applying different sorts of solutions, including effective jammers that jams the signals of the FE drones so that the operator cannot control the drone, or the drone cannot send signals back to the operator. We have seen the emergence of total tanks, which is applying a lot of armor, slat armor, which is essentially cages, and then slapping a lot of steel plates on top of the tank uh, to protect against these drones. Now, keep in mind, while they are moderately effective against a couple of FPV drones, the vulnerability still remains that I can. The FPV drones are so cheap that I can launch dozens of these FPV drones against a single tank to take them out, and no turtle tank would be able to defend itself against dozens of FPV drones. Perhaps two, three, four FPV drones, perhaps, but not dozens, right? But the enemy can afford to throw dozens because they are so cheap. The other problem that happens with these additional armor, it makes the tank very heavy, significantly heavy than what you might want your tanks to be, and it reduces your field of vision. Uh, some other tanks, especially the Western tanks and Israeli tanks, have started deploying their own active protection system, like Trophy, which can shoot down certain types of incoming weapons, like a shoulder fired anti tank guided missile. But keep in mind that these solutions are not foolproof, and these solutions are very expensive, right? Um, and the Indian uh, army won't certainly be able to afford these solutions in all of our tanks. Secondly, if Indian army decides to slap in active protection systems, or ERA, explosive reactive armors, or even rudimentary armors on top of the tank would actually become much more heavier. Let's say a 25-ton tank might become a 33-ton tank, and then you will not have the same maneuvering speed for the type of engine and the power system this tank has. So it defeats the original purpose itself. That is, the tank won't be able to respond and maneuver effectively against the PLA, right? So I think slapping a lot of armor or slapping expensive solutions on the tank to protect itself from the weapons in the modern battlefield is a no go for India. And we can be absolutely certain that the PLA, that is the Chinese army, will certainly deploy weapons like FPV drones, anti tank guided missiles, anti tank rockets, loitering munitions in plenty, right? So, plain and simple, the Zoravar light tank by itself will not be able to survive any protracted warfare. While it can serve be effective when you are not shooting against each other, and you can effectively counter deploy. But on a real war, where your enemy is firing against you and deploying their weapons against you, where you are under actual fire, I'm sorry to say, but Zorawar will not survive the battlefield against the PLA, right? By its own, unless the Indian army brings in additional capabilities to play, so that Zorawar, light tanks like Zorawar, can survive in combination with other weapons. It needs complementary weapons. So, what should the Indian Army planners do instead? Right? In my opinion, the while developing Zorawar is fine, but as we saw, Zorawar cannot survive by itself. So it needs to be complemented by building an army of loitering munitions and FPV drones. We shouldn't try to match PLA, right? Weapon to weapon, tank to tank. It won't work. PLA has a much higher budget. They spend almost 4 times the amount that we spend on our army. They have a much better supply chain, much better manufacturing. We cannot match PLA one is to one. It's very difficult. We should focus on asymmetric warfare. The same story that we see, which Ukraine has used to resist Russia, which many players in the world, many smaller players in the world has used to protect itself against a larger player. We have to use asymmetric warfare. So, and why loitering munitions and FPV drones in would provide us the asymmetric capability? Because number one, it will be very cheap, right? It will be unjammable, because we should build something that is equipped with AI and intelligence that can detect enemy and find and seek enemy out and destroy the enemy by itself without requiring an operator, right? So it becomes very difficult to jam. It is there, since there is no dedicated operator, it one cannot simply kill an operator and hope that the drone will be destroyed, because that can't happen. uh, these drones, this AI enabled drones, would also have countermeasures that would be able to evade SHORADs. And we've seen examples of that. For example, we've seen examples where Russia has um, deployed countermeasures in its long range cruise missiles, which can detect enemy surface to air missiles and can launch chaff and flare. And more importantly, it should be mass produced. It should be cheap, and it should be mass produced. It should be cheap, significantly cheaper than the medium to long range surface to air missiles that PLA deploys in these regions. It should be significantly cheaper than the air to air missiles that the PLA Air Force will use to bring these drones down, right? If you can make it so cheap that it becomes very expensive and cost prohibitive for PLA to destroy them, that gives you a significant asymmetric advantage, right? I hope the Indian army planners are paying attention to this, and I hope they build a strategy that creates an effective counter that can complement light tanks and light armor that operates in the mountainous regions via solutions like AI enabled FPV drones and AI enabled loitering munitions. I have complete confidence that uh, India has all the capability within itself to work on uh, image recognition, video recognition, AI because India doesn't have any dearth of software engineers and AI engineers, right? Um, and India will not have any problems. India is under no sanctions, and India will not have any problems in securing cheap hardware from Western manufacturers as well. So I don't think there would be any challenge in developing such weapons. Indian Army should definitely engage the private industry to develop these weapons, and I think in the light armored platforms like Zorawar, in conjunction with these weapons, can effectively deter the PLA in invading India in Ladakh and other Himalayan regions. Namaste and Jai Hind.